Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending upon where you're watching from. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you to America at a Crossroads. On behalf of our leadership team, Zev Yaroslavsky, former Congressman Mel Levine, Rabbi Chasen, and Caroline Kelly, and of course, always remembering our beloved David Lehrer, may he rest in peace. I welcome today's extraordinary guests, Sarah Longwell and Simon Rosenberg, and our equally extraordinary moderator, Larry Mantle. Thank you all for being with us and for sharing your perspectives, especially since tonight we are almost in direct conflict with the GOP debate. So although I think you can watch one and then the next, but thanks so much for being with us. We only have 3 more programs in 2023. It's hard to believe that the year's almost over. Here's a reminder that on Monday night, December 11th, that's a week from this past Monday, so this next coming Monday, we will have our 6th Israel in Crisis program featuring Aaron David Miller. Aaron David Miller spent 24 years with the United States State Department as a Middle East negotiator and is now with Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He will be focusing on the Biden administration's policy towards the Israel-Hamas war in conversation with Pat Morrison. And that will be our last Israel in Crisis program for the year. We have done 6 over the last 6 weeks. We appreciate the extraordinary attendance of people who come to those programs. Next Wednesday, a week from tonight, December 13th, we will welcome Ann Applebaum of The Atlantic, who will discuss a world at war with Warren Only. Ann Applebaum has won the Pulitzer Prize, more than one Booker Award, and just about every other award one can win as a nonfiction author and journalist. It will be an extraordinary hour and will definitely bring us up to date on the Russia-Ukraine war, which is one of the foci of her work. By the way, yes, I did mention Pat Morrison will be the moderator with Aaron David Miller. Then our final program for 2023 will be with Franklin Foer. I'm not exactly sure how he pronounces his name, but it's F-O-E-R, also of The Atlantic, formerly of the New Republic. He will be discussing the topic of his newly released book, Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for Americans' Future. And he will be in conversation with Madeline Brand. We will be dark the very last week of the year. In the email you get this afternoon, right after the program, you can register for all 3 of these programs. And I provided some very interesting articles and links, some of which are not behind paywalls, some of them are. But I hope I've tried to work it so they're mostly not behind paywalls, but I've done my best on that front. You should take a look at some of those interesting articles from each of our upcoming speakers. Hanukkah starts this Thursday evening. And rather than a message about wars and the Maccabees or about Israel, Gaza, or Ukraine, I will simply focus on the word Hanukkah, which literally translates to the word dedication. As we light our menorahs this Thursday and for the 7 days thereafter, we all acknowledge that this is not the happiest of times in our world. Wars rage and people are dying and suffering, and the future is uncertain. Even with all of that, this Hanukkah, I will think about what it means to dedicate oneself to values beyond oneself. It takes work, it can be painful at times, but ultimately we work towards the day that hope and light will prevail over darkness and that we can find peace. With that, I wish you all a happy Hanukkah. Now, please welcome Larry Mantle. Larry Mantle is a radio interview call-in host in Southern California. And if you live anywhere near Southern California, you did not need to be told that. He has been the host of Air Talk with Larry Mantle on NPR member station well, it's actually called LAS now. It used to be called KPCC at 89.3 FM since April 1st, 1985. Air Talk is the longest running daily talk show in Southern California. He has won scores and scores of awards and accolades, and we are grateful, very grateful to benefit from his warmth, his intelligence, and his ample set of skills. Larry?
Thank you, Janice, and I'm very grateful to again be a part of America at a Crossroads. I look forward to these Wednesday nights so much. And so thank you, Janice and Mel and Zev. It's a privilege to be here. We're so pleased to have another terrific pair of guests, as you become accustomed to, on these Wednesday night programs and the additional programs like this coming Monday nights as well. Tonight, we'll be speaking with Simon Rosenberg, the longtime political analyst, strategist, and commentator, and Sarah Longwell, publisher of The Bulwark. Simon founded the New Democrat Network, later NDN, in 1996, from which the New Policy Institute arose. It's a liberal think tank and advocacy group. Simon writes the popular blog Hopium Chronicles on Substack. And Sarah's news and opinion website, The Bulwark, offers conservative news and opinion. She's been a prominent voice in the Never Trump movement and operates the DC communications firm Longwell Partners. She also heads the organization Republicans for the Rule of Law. Sarah and Simon, great to be with you this evening. Sarah, let me start with news made this afternoon. Senate Republicans holding fast against the $110 billion aid bill supporting Ukraine and Israel. Republicans are holding out for tightening asylum rules, expanding asylum detention centers, and cutting the current record high number of illegal border crossings. The human consequences of an impasse on the bill are obviously huge, but are there significant political consequences likely to follow? Sarah?
Oh, I wish I could say there were. Republicans just don't get in trouble for not passing big bills. And I think, and a lot of times when you say, are there going to be political consequences? So much of that depends on Democrats and how much Democrats are willing to go on offense against Republicans and make them pay for these things. And as Simon knows, as a longtime Republican, raised in the conservative and Republican way of doing things, which is sort of knife in the teeth, I have a constant frustration with Democrats for not being able to find their sort of offense gear and make Republicans pay when they're being obstructionists like this, or when they're holding very important things hostage. And so this is one of those moments where I think the question about whether or not Republicans will pay for this has a lot to do with whether or not Democrats are willing to make them pay.
But even as Republicans are obstructing this bill, on the issue of immigration, isn't there a significant amount of public support for tightening the borders, for restricting asylum?
This is one of there is something to be said for the fact that this is a good example of where our politics has become so broken that there is no attempt to negotiate anything here. I do think Democrats are up for giving them something. I mean, I'm not privy to how these the negotiations are so broken down and not really happening that it's hard to get a sense of. It's not like you're seeing a ton of press about the horse trading that's going on, people trying to decide, well, we'll do this if you do this. I mean, it just seems like everybody just sort of is letting these bills sort of pass them by and deciding we're just going to do nothing.
Simon, your thoughts about this, and do you see any repercussions politically?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons that Tuberville conceded this week his blockade and pulled his blockade down is I think Republicans were sensitive to the idea that they could be responsible for killing Ukraine funding, holding up the bill for funding Israel, and holding up all these Pentagon appointments, and this idea that they could have been cast by Democrats as being unpatriotic and betraying the country and the world, really, in a time of enormous crisis. It's very interesting that Tuberville pulled all of his, he allowed all but a handful of the military appointments to go ahead after many, many months. And I think that's a sign of weakness for them, right? They know they had to make some concessions here because they knew there was potential danger depending how this played out. I mean, on a substantive level, the problem the Democrats have is the bill that the Republicans passed in the House, H.R. 2, which is the piece of the immigration border bill, which they're sticking to very, closely, is so extreme and so wild that it's not something Democrats could have ever supported. And there isn't negotiation. The Republicans aren't giving any ground in any meaningful way. And the question, we're in a little bit of a game of chicken here. I mean, I don't really know what's going to happen. I think we have to read the Tuberville cave as a sign that Republicans or perhaps don't have as strong a hand as they think they have. But this is going to be a very consequential set of negotiations over the next few weeks. And there's not an obvious path here, right, for getting a deal. And it's, there's going to have to be significant concessions made by one side or the other. We also don't know that the Republicans in the House will agree to what the Senate agrees to if a deal gets done in the Senate. So we've got weeks ahead of rough times here. And let's hope that we come out the other end of this with Israel funding, with, the Ukraine funding, with a reasonable border bill, But, you know, it's hard to see how we're going to get there today.
Simon, are there though enough immigration hawks among Democrats? Because it's not something that's strictly a Republican issue. I host a public radio program. I regularly hear from liberal Democratic listeners who express concern about U.S. immigration policy. Is that something on which Democrats are at all vulnerable?
I think a lot of Democrats, particularly those running in 2024, would like a muscular immigration border bill and to sort of take this thing off the table or make it less likely that it continues to be an issue into 2024. You know, there isn't really a big public debate around this because this was kind of pulled out at the end and jammed into a bill that normally, you know, it's not like we're holding hearings on this and there's big discussions around this. This was kind of jammed into the negotiations in just recent weeks. And so I think Democrats were surprised how much the Republicans are holding fast on this, particularly with some Republicans who had been more malleable in immigration. But I will tell you that a lot of the Democrats who are up in 2024, I think would vote in a heartbeat for a very muscular and strong bill to make it less likely this continues to be an issue and to give them more to go on offense with in the elections next year.
Sarah, you were going to say something there?
No, the only thing I was going to agree is how I think that Democrats consistently underestimate how vulnerable they are on immigration. When you talk, if you do one of these call-in shows, you realize how top of mind this is. And one of the things that I always try to explain to people when they ask, like, I don't understand the whole Trump thing. Like, how did he happen? And that build the wall, the attempting to and of course he was demagoguing immigration in the way that he was doing it. But I do think that it's important to recognize how much that spoke to a broad swath of people and how much right now, when I listen to voters across the political spectrum, there's two things they talk about. They talk about the economy and they talk about immigration. And so I think having some way to move, that's why if there was a negotiation taking place, I think that Democrats would be willing to give Republicans something on border security in exchange for this. And I think that that would be, I'm not sure Republicans are that interested in a solution, to be quite honest, because they don't want to fund Ukraine. Or at least not enough of them want to fund Ukraine, that it's worth giving Democrats sort of a win on an issue that Republicans think they're the most vulnerable on.
I think what Sarah just said is really important. I mean, the incentives for Republicans to do a deal here are, you know, remote. I mean, are limited. And because they don't really want to give Democrats a way out on immigration. They don't want to make it look like Biden and the Democrats are capable of working with Republicans to solve the border challenges that we have. And to Sarah's point, I mean, the polling in the Republican Party in Ukraine is not good. They don't really want to do it. Mike Johnson, I don't think, wants to have this be the thing that he does in his early days. But we'll see what happens. I mean, I think that the Israel, you know, whether Israel pops out of this independently, how it all moves forward, I think, you know, we're in the early stages of what's going to be a very difficult next few weeks.
Well, and this is what I was going to follow with you, Simon, is that because Israel and advanced weapons for Israel are included in there, and Republicans are, falling all over each other with support for Israel. So, I mean, could this become an issue for them if that really gets highlighted, the lack of financial support for the Israeli military?
Yeah, I think that, you know, there is some polling showing that the speaker fiasco that happened further weakened an already weakened Republican brand in the House. The congressional Republicans, according to one of our top polling outfits, took a substantial hit during the speaker fiasco, and their numbers are terrible. They all know this, right? I mean, they're not under, just like Sarah mentioned, that we may be under, you know, taking too much for granted in immigration. I think the Republicans on the Hill are aware that they're in a very precarious position with the public. I think it's one of the reasons Mike Johnson kind of became the clean guy, came in to sort of clean everything up. And so they're, you know, Mike Johnson, even just doing the extended CR that he did, the continuing resolution, pushing it to January, there was enormous risk for him in doing that right out of the box. But he was able to convince his colleagues, I think, because they know their numbers are in bad shape. And so this is going to be very complicated. You've got a very inexperienced new speaker who's still trying to find his way through a caucus, you know, a conference that is, you know, wildly divided. Their numbers are terrible. And, you know, there's not an easy, clear understanding of how we get a deal here. But that's look, Joe Biden has been doing this a long time. He's been able to get remarkable things done. I mean, one of the things that's made him a successful president is that he doesn't give up on these kinds of negotiations. And we'll see what happens.
Yeah, Sarah, I wanted to ask you about the division on Israel among Democrats, because many Democrats are not supporting President Biden's policy in giving full support to Israel. So what politically are the potential consequences in the Democratic division?
Yeah, look, I think from what I hear from my Democratic friends, and I'd be interested in what Simon thinks about this, the biggest thing that they are afraid of, I would say actually they're afraid of a number of things, but I would say one of the major ones is that they lose their progressive foot soldiers, right? So right now we're going into an election where turnout is going to be extraordinarily important. And Democrats really rely on sort of young people and the activist progressive base to go door knocking, to like create the enthusiasm, to be this engine for turnout. And right now, that is the exact demographic that seems to be feeling alienated from, let's say, the slightly more establishment, grown-up part of the Democratic Party, who's been quite good on Israel. And that fracture, I think, is just creating the sense that because here's the thing, 2024, you're not building a pro-Joe Biden coalition. You're building an anti-Trump coalition. And they need all the turnout that they can get for everybody who's afraid of Trump. And this narrative where people are saying, I refuse to vote for Biden, I've been betrayed by Biden. I think there's real fear on the Democratic side that that's going to really eat into sort of already lackluster enthusiasm for Joe Biden. I will say, I think that actually that's not quite right. I think that I understand how panicked Democrats are, and I think this is not good for the party to be this fractured at this moment. I do think that there's a lot of time to recover. And if there is one thing that Donald Trump has been able to do for the last 5 years, it is paper over what are real fundamental problems and schisms within the Democratic Party and get everybody united in opposition to him. And so I still hold out a lot of hope that that can happen. But I do think it's a tricky thing for Democrats to navigate. I will say one last thing, which is just how impressed I've been personally with Joe Biden. I think one of my great frustrations is how little credit he's getting from the center right for how incredibly strong he's been on Israel. And I'm disappointed that people haven't sort of rallied to him a little bit more on this, because he's been quite sort of up until very recently, where I think he's trying to balance his constituency. He's been quite clear morally on the issue.
So Simon, do you think there's anything, given Sarah's contention that there's concern over losing the progressive foot soldiers, that Biden's going to temper his support for Israel down the road?
Let me make a few points on that. So one is, I think that the schism or the opposition in the Democratic Party has been a little bit exaggerated. I mean, if you look at the Economist YouGov poll this week, Biden's approval rating on the war is actually still about +30 in their weekly track, and only about 28% of Democrats are not approving of him. And the group that actually is most approving of the age groups that are most approving of Biden on the war is actually 18 to 29-year-olds. And so
really,
I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we don't have issues, but I also think the schism, the size and significance of the schism has been exaggerated. And it means that it's more likely that we're going to be able to put this all back together. The second thing is the schism that emerged on October 7th had no impact, or the war had no impact on the November elections. I mean, we have to remember, as Sarah mentioned, that Democrats keep, since Dobbs happened in the spring of 2022, Democrats keep performing at extraordinary levels when actual voting happens, right? We gained in 2022, we gained ground in Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, Michigan, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania. In 2023, we won elections all across the country in Republican places like Colorado Springs and Jacksonville. We got to 56% in Wisconsin, and we just won in Ohio and took away the 6-week abortion ban with 57%. So our coalition is continually performing at the upper end of what's possible, regardless of who the candidate is. To me, it's a structural thing. I still think, as Sarah mentioned, the thing driving our politics, and it's been driving it since 2018, has been fear and opposition to MAGA. It's the most powerful force in our politics today. And so I feel, and then third, to echo what she said, is we have time, right? Our coalition hasn't, some of our coalition is wandering right now. There's no question about that. I think once it's Biden, Trump, most of that's going to come home, not all of it. And then we've got a campaign to go get the rest. But I feel, if you look at polling this week, in the last week, there have been 6 national polls showing Biden either tied or ahead. This notion that he was down, I think he was down for a little while, right? I think back in October, he kind of dipped a little bit.
Yeah.
Polling this week has been very strong. So in general, the way I feel about this, like, I think we're in good shape. I'm optimistic about 2024 because we keep winning elections everywhere. But, we've got work to do, and we can't, I'm optimistic,
Well,
but I'm not confident. Right?
But we're sort of predicating this all, then it's a rematch of Biden and Trump,
Yeah.
which the odds are in favor of that. But given both men's ages, given Trump's many legal travails, that's not guaranteed. So, Sarah, let's say that Nikki Haley is the Republican nominee, or that it's not Joe Biden. It's one of a number of Democratic candidates that might emerge if Joe Biden is no longer the Democratic candidate. What happens then? And do the issues reform in a different way?
So I'm willing to engage on this in the hypothetical and run you through what I think various scenarios are, but I want to be very clear. Donald Trump and Joe Biden are going to be the nominees. And Nikki Haley's not going to beat Donald Trump in a Republican primary. And I think the debate tonight is an undercard debate. It is for somebody to emerge in second place so that they can get up to about 30% to Trump's increasing. He's at about 60% right now of the Republican Party. I think it is just extraordinarily unlikely. And the reason I think it's unlikely is that every week ever since Donald Trump came out of the scene, I've been trying to understand better what I missed with the Republican Party. And so I do focus groups every week across the political spectrum, but I focus on 2-time Trump voters and swing voters. And the Republican Party has changed in ways they don't want Nikki Haley. The voters say things like, well, she's a rhino, she's establishment, even if they think she's nice enough, she's okay, but she's not who I want to vote for president, because I want to make America great again. I believe in America first policies. They believe that Donald Trump changed the party for the better. And I cannot overemphasize how much it is his party. Now, if Nikki Haley were to, let's say she does get into second place, and I think it is worth supporting Nikki Haley in this moment to move her into second place. I'm much more comfortable with her than I am with Ron DeSantis, although she has proved herself, I think, lacking in many ways in terms of her support for Donald Trump. But there's just no doubt something would have gone really right with the Republican Party for her to win. I think Trump would have to die. I think he would have to have a health event for her to beat him and become the nominee. If she were the nominee, I think she would beat Joe Biden by 6 points. And I think that Joe Biden would be in a really tough spot. And I think that if something happens to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris is the nominee, and Simon and I have chatted about this before. I think another frustration that I have had with some of the folks in Biden world is you don't hear much on the plan B side. And we all know that something here could happen. And the plan B, if something happens to Joe Biden, and he doesn't have to die, he could break his hip or have a major health event of some other kind. Kamala Harris is the plan B, and Donald Trump will beat her. And I think that I think the stakes are, I sort of agree with Simon, basically. I think that Simon is functionally correct in how he's assessing things. I still think the alarm, the consequence of Donald Trump being the nominee are so dire and so high that there is no room for a kind of I think we're okay. I think we're in good shape. We basically have to treat this, I think, as the existential threat that it is.
Sarah, just as an aside to help people better understand Republican voters, this is a party that historically thought of itself as conservative, even as recent Republican presidents have engaged in significant spending. And we've seen the size of the federal government grow even under Republican administrations. But at least nominally, the party gave a nod to fiscal conservatism. And now it's really become, under Trump, a populist socialist party, a party that is adherent to his personality. So what happened to conservatism? You said in the focus groups that Republicans thought now the party was finally on the right track. Is it that the majority of Republicans never really were conservative? They were populist and just thought of themselves as conservative? How do you explain that?
I mean, this has been an evolution, and you'd get different answers from this, I think, from Democrats, because I think there's a lot of Democrats who would argue that where we are in the Republican Party today is just a logical extension of where it's always been. It does not feel like that to me, as somebody who sort of grew up in the conservative movement. It feels like sort of two things happened at the same time. One, there was a major backlash to Barack Obama's presidency among the right. The Tea Party movement had the veneer of being a movement about the debt and the deficit but it was mostly just about being anti-Obama. And I think the populist movement sort of started there, and it coincided. A lot of this shift started to happen around between 2012, 2014, as social media became like just such a ubiquitous part of the conversation, and it democratized information in a way that I think has had some benefits and then some real negative impacts on, and you see this, that's why populism in America is a reflection of also what's happening in the world. Some of it is a reaction to immigration and the changing immigration trends across the globe. But right-wing populism and the rise of right-wing sort of nationalist populism is happening across the globe. It is happening here in America. And the party has actively changed. Like a few things there is also a political realignment occurring. So a lot of these Mitt Romney, John McCain, college-educated suburban voters have been moving toward the Democratic Party. And a lot of these white working class secular voters, some of whom maybe even voted for Obama, but a lot of them who had felt maybe they were voting for Republicans before, maybe they were voting for more populist Democrats, they have become huge MAGAs. And I can't stress enough how much things have changed, how much there's been party realignment, how much Trump has brought new people into the party that were not there before, that have changed the contours of the party.
Simon, you had thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree with much of what Sarah said. I mean, I think one thing that's important for the Democrats here tonight is that there's all this analysis about how the Democratic Party is in decline and our coalition's fraying and how we weren't what we used to be. And I just want to remind everybody that in the last 4 presidential elections, we've gotten 51% of the vote on average, and Republicans have gotten 46%. We've won those elections by an average of 5 points in each election. The last time we averaged 51% in 4 elections was in the 1930s and 40s under FDR, right? I mean, we're going through. The Democratic Party is very strong right now, even if it doesn't feel that way oftentimes during, this time where Trump just takes up so much space. And I think Sarah's right. I mean, I think what's happened to her point about the swing of suburbanites into the, wealthy, formerly Republican suburbanites into the Democratic coalition has been accelerated by abortion and by what happened with Dobbs in 2022. I mean, you've seen this has become a major. Dobbs was a before and after moment in our politics, and it wasn't just voters. It also brought enormous amounts of people into became activists and who are giving money and making phone calls and writing postcards and doing all the things.
And you think that'll continue, that the wake of Dobbs,
there's no
that
question.
energy will continue?
Yeah, and what I speculated in 2022 was that things would be worse for Republicans in 2024 and 2023 once people began to understand the extremist policies that were put into place, not just the end of Roe, right, but the 6-week abortion ban, the extremism of the 10-year-old girls having babies and so on. And that's what's happened. I mean, the abortion issue has gotten worse for Republicans. The victory that we just had in Ohio, right, a state where we have been really struggling for a long time to get to 57% on a ballot initiative to take away a 6-week abortion ban. In Virginia, right, the Republicans who lost the state house in Virginia in November are blaming Youngkin for pushing the 15-week ban as the reason that the House flipped to the Democrats. So, the election is very different. This election is very different than 2020. There are 2 things that have happened that will make 2024 very different. One is Trump tried to overthrow an American election and end American democracy. and the party of Lincoln and Reagan now will forever be the party that tried to end American democracy. This is material. People are voting on this, as Sarah mentioned. The other thing that's changed is abortion. And I still think we're still learning the contours of this, but certainly we know from polling that, independent women and Republican-leaning women are now much more available to Democrats than they were before. And if we're smart, right, it creates opportunities for us to grow our coalition, not just hold pat in 2024.
If the suburban women that you're talking about, we colloquially use that term.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's more complex than that. But Sarah, if those voters have been lost to the Republican Party, largely because of Trump and because of abortion policy, are they recoverable for Republicans?
They'd be, I mean, if Nikki Haley was the nominee, I think a lot of them would vote for her. I mean, I don't know if you've been listening to Nikki on abortion, but she has tried to stake out a much more sort of palatable, mainstream, general election type position. But let me just, I want to take Simon's framework and I want to give you like some good news and some bad news. So I think on the good news front, when we've done a lot of focus groups with young voters and young progressives, who are the people that Democrats right now are really fretting about, as we kicked off with, they're really fretting about losing those people. And actually what we heard from them was they were really down on Biden. They were, thought he was out of touch and they weren't excited to vote for him. They were super excited to go vote in their local elections. They were going to vote for Biden, but they really wanted to go vote in their local elections, in part because of abortion, but also just because they liked the candidates. They were engaged on the local level. And I was really surprised. It jumps out at you how interested they are in local elections. And I do think that on the abortion issue locally, that can power, it would be called sort of a reverse coattails effect, right? Normally in a national election, the president has these big coattails down ballot. It looks like for Democrats, you could actually see the reverse of that, where the local elections drive out young people, get them excited, and that helps Biden. I would say on the bad news front on abortion is two things. When you look at states like Ohio, when you just put something on the ballot and you disaggregate the general election and you just deal with abortion, that really works. You're going to win that because there are a ton of two-time Trump voters who are pro-choice or who don't like that it was repealed. I think that when it's in the context of a bigger general election and there's lots of other things in the mix, it is not quite as helpful. I also think one of the reasons that these elections, where these off-year elections or the special elections, like in Wisconsin, have gone so well for Democrats is that a lot of these college-educated suburban voters who are moving to Democrats are incredibly reliable, high-info voters in special elections. When you're dealing with a big national messy election, Trump he can both turn out all the people opposed to him, but he also pulls in all these low info, never vote in an off-year election, never vote in a special election. I just show up to vote for Trump people. And those people, like, abortion is not a thing that's going to make them not vote for Trump. So one of the things to understand about Trump and the Republican Party is that Republican voters view him as a social moderate. They believe he has paid for abortions. People make that joke all the time in focus groups. They think he's paid for abortions, that he's fine with abortion. He's a social moderate, and they like that about him. Ron DeSantis did himself in with that 6-week abortion ban. If the Republicans were, or if the Democrats were running against Ron DeSantis, abortion would be just absolutely, would be rocket fuel for turnout. Trump is trickier because even though he put those Supreme Court justices on there, you're going to have to work. You're going to have to work to hang that around his neck because voters just generally kind of who aren't that tapped in think of him not as somebody who's going to be real radical on these social issues like abortion.
Interesting. Let's move on to take some viewer questions. Bob asks on immigration, why does anyone think something humane can be done to stop the flow? Why not promote more money for impacted communities, for more staffing, both at the border and in immigration courts? Simon, you want to respond to that?
This is such a complicated, I've worked on immigration for 20 years at a policy level. Look, we're in a very anomalous period now in terms of the flow that's coming to the border. It's not just coming from Mexico and from nearby countries. It's now, the big tipping point that pushed the immigration system into overflow was immigration coming from Venezuela, for example, which is much further away. And we had never had large numbers of Venezuelans. And there are more people coming from further, and for Cubans, for example, right, are coming now as immigrants. It's because wet foot, dry foot is no longer the old system is not in place. And so part of what's happened, and the reason this thing feels a little bit out of control right now, is that the smuggling networks are capable now of bringing people from much further away in high volume. And this is, part of the businesses of the cartels, right, is to do human smuggling like this. And so we're getting overwhelmed. And the system that we have in place that Democrats have been trying to change for almost 20 years can't accommodate, it never imagined a system, a flow of this magnitude towards the border. It had never happened before. We've had periods where Mexicans came, but not the kind of regional flow that we're getting. So we have to really reimagine our entire immigration system. We need a big debate about it, right? We're not having that big debate. We're having this backroom negotiation. And so it's going to be, there's no question in my mind, and I say this as a Democrat, is that the system we have where anyone can come to the country and make an asylum claim is no longer tenable for us. It was imagined at a very different time, and we need to reimagine now. What the Republicans are trying to do is go way too far in the way that they're setting this up. But the idea that we have to let go of as Democrats is that anyone who comes to a port of entry, anyone who turns himself in, gets their day in court, gets to come into the country for 5 years before their court case. That can't be the system, because that is a draw for people all around the world. So we do need to do something. And I'm hopeful. I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful that something smart and meaningful can come out of these negotiations.
Well, one of you might recall the poll. I'm sorry that I can't, but a couple of months ago, there was a poll of Venezuelans which showed an overwhelming majority of Venezuelans said if they felt they could come to the United States to live, they would do it. That circumstances are so bad there.
Yeah, and look, the leader of Venezuela is aligned with Vladimir Putin, and this is, Putin has often used migratory flows to disrupt politics. He's doing it right now on the border with Ukraine, and so these are very complicated issues. And I do think, to echo something Sarah said earlier, I think the president has been too defensive about this. They have not figured out a way to go on offense, to make it clear where he stands on this, to make it clear that he knows this is a serious problem. He's got a plan to go fix it. They've been very reticent in engaging on this for reasons that we could sit here and debate for hours. But I think it's cost us, because as you mentioned, I think, Larry, earlier, there's never really been a period, over the last 30 years where Democrats have been below Republicans in the approval on immigration. And we're substantially below Republicans now on this. And it is a vulnerability, particularly in some of the Southwestern, the states where this stuff will play more intensely than others.
Where it affects them more on a regular basis. Sarah, a quick thought on this, then I'm going to get back to some other questions.
I don't have much more to add on the immigration thing. Because I see a bunch of questions in there about one of the things, if I may, that I think I would like to address. Again, going back to some of you asked this before and I didn't quite hit it, which is people seem to think that Trump might be in jail, like that there's these exogenous events that could take him out. Trump is not going to jail. Trump's not going to be in jail before the election. The complications of putting the Republican nominee for president, which he will be, the first case doesn't even get started. It's like on March 4th, which is the day before Super Tuesday. Like, there is no timeline that makes sense for how Trump would be. Now, could he be a convicted felon? He's still not going to. Could he be a convicted felon by the time the general election happens? Yes. Can that impact public opinion about him? Yes, but no one's doing this job for us but the voters.
Let me ask another question here. This is from Larry. What kind of effect are third-party candidates going to have, if any? Sarah?
Great question. So one of the functions and the problems of Joe Biden's perceived weakness is that we're just going to get this flood of third-party, some carnival barkers, some people trying to do something more serious. And I'll go back to what I said. I sort of preach this a lot, and I want people to hold this because it's really important. You're not building a pro-Joe Biden coalition. You're building an anti-Trump coalition. That's your broadest possible coalition. Anything that fractures that coalition, anything that pulls from it, okay, is bad for Joe Biden because you need that intact. And so you can throw just about any person, and that includes Liz Cheney, who I am an enormous fan of, but Liz Cheney should not run a third-party candidacy. No Labels should pull the plug immediately and stop trying to get on ballots. And if No Labels runs a campaign that is Larry Hogan and Joe Manchin, the only people that vote for that ticket are the 7% of people that I try to appeal to in general elections, who are right-leaning independents, soft GOP voters, some maybe disaffected Democrats, but those are the people who are part of the anti-Trump coalition, right? And when you fracture that, they may not love voting for Joe Biden. They don't consider themselves Democrats, but they will either hold their nose and vote for Joe Biden, or they will sit it at, mostly they'll vote for Joe Biden. But if they start fracturing into third party, you have a real problem where you've basically taken the critical 6% in swing states that Joe Biden needs to win away from him. And they are not going to win. Anybody who tells you, the No Labels is out there shopping some map in which they have their unnamed candidates, because they haven't put forward anyone actually yet, winning the state of Delaware. Now, if you think that Joe Biden is going to lose his home state to a third-party ticket, then you have not thought about politics very much. And so they are a bunch of people selling a fantasy, and they should stop. And people like JFK and
Cornel West,
Cornel
or
West,
yeah.
you know, or not JFK, sorry, RFK. I do this all the time. You know, like I said before, that you've got this big contingency of double haters. And Joe Biden has to win the double haters. You have to have people who hate Trump more than Biden, where they're just like, don't like Biden, but they really hate Trump. But a lot of those people, if they ditch out to RFK or they ditch out to Cornel West, especially young voters, they go to Cornel West. That's a huge problem for Biden.
You don't think that there's a potential loss of some people who were would hold their nose and vote for Trump because of their dislike for Biden and Democratic policies, who might go with a No Labels candidate that it might take from Trump as well?
I think that if you are that out on Trump, that Joe Biden is available to you. Like there is like, okay. When I did Republican voters against Trump, we have focused, and we ran in 2022, we focused on, Republican voters against Kari Lake, Republican voters against Herschel Walker. I have no greater expertise than in this slim margin of Republicans that you can persuade to vote against the Republican. They don't like to vote for the Democrat, but they will vote against the Republican when they think they are too extreme, and when the Democrat is acceptable. Those people will vote for the No Labels candidate. They will ditch out to them, and Joe Biden will miss out on critical margins.
We have a question from Douglas. How does the expulsion of George Santos and today's abrupt decision by McCarthy not to run for re-election impact the Republican majority in the House starting next year? Simon?
Well, there's now going to be a special election for Santos's seat on February 13th. We are likely to have a really good candidate. It will be a competitive race. And, they're down to 3. And we also learned today from reporting that the ethics committee investigation into Matt Gaetz is now been restarted because they finished with Santos. And Kevin McCarthy has been saying publicly that he thinks that Gaetz will get kicked out of Congress and, potentially or be challenged by the ethics finding and the ethics investigation. So I think the bigger issue it does is just continues to convey the chaos and the lack of adults in the room, and of the Republican Party in Washington, and sort of this Star Wars bar, that's now trying to govern the country. And I think all of this helps weaken and undermine the Republican brand, in the battlegrounds where we need it. And if I can just say one thing about the third party thing, because I agree with much of what Sarah said, I think there are 2 other just quick points I want to add. I do think it's possible in this election that Biden could be running against 4 or 5 candidates. And, we've never had a presidential election like that. I mean, this means that it's not like 2000 or 2016. And the Biden campaign is going to have to reimagine the way they run a presidential election against so many candidates, because they're going to have to engage. To Sarah's point, they have to engage and degrade these candidates and make them less attractive opponents. And the campaign is going to have to take responsibility for that. And it's hard. I mean, it's hard to run against one candidate, but they're going to have to run against 4 or 5. The second thing is, I also believe the Never Trumper movement. If the Biden team is going to have to enter into some kind of, coalition where hopefully we get Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney campaigning for us, and that there becomes a more formal alignment with this group so it doesn't wander, right? Because to the credit of Sarah and her colleagues, our victories in 2020 and 2022, they played a major role in helping us win. They've been part of our coalition and part of our family. She's here tonight. And we need to be more intentional and overt. I mean, if we were in a parliamentary system, Liz Cheney would have set up her own party. She'd be in the cabinet, defense secretary, whatever it is. There would have been a formal coming together of this anti-Trump coalition. We don't have that system here, right? So I think the Biden team is going to have to work hard to make sure that this segment that has been instrumental in our recent victories stays with us and doesn't wander into these other alternatives.
Judy asks, what explains the lack of enthusiasm by young Black and Latino men for Biden? Are they progressives, part of the progressive movement? What do you think's behind that? Is that, Simon, is that something you've done any research on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there isn't sort of and Sarah's going to have an opinion on this, but there isn't, I would say, a single interpretation of why this has happened. But my view is that I think during the 2020 election, Biden won COVID. COVID was the dominant issue, and he won COVID voters in the exit polls by 3-1. Among the voters who said the economy was number one, and remember, people of color and lower socioeconomic status who couldn't be working from home and had to go, feed their families and still go to work. Biden, we lost economic voters 4-1 in the 2020 election. Biden entered the White House in a deficit on the economy. They didn't run a lot of ads around the economy. There wasn't a big conversation. There was a big conversation around COVID. And I think that for young men in particular, in lower socioeconomic status, the shutdown Democrat attack on us has stuck. It's still with us a little bit, that Biden wasn't on the right side of opportunity for people who are working for a living. And I think for young people, right, we talk about what's happened with young people. I mean, imagine what young people have gone through, right? I have 3 Gen Z kids who are 18, 21, 23. COVID, the war, insurrection, right? There's been a lot of chaos. And Biden, so rather than seeing the chaos being with Trump, for some young people, they're seeing the chaos with Biden, right? Okay. And lack of economic opportunity. So I think my view is this is work that we can do, and we can get these voters back, but it's only if we do the work and run a good campaign to restore the coalition that we need to win.
Sarah, your thoughts on this? And I was wondering if there's evidence of an increasing political gender gap.
I don't think so, actually. I mean, I think that there's what I tend to focus on is the education gap. I think that is becoming much more predictive than just about anything else. Like having a college degree, which is actually a problem for Democrats, is that it is a party that is appealing more often to college educated voters, of which there are fewer than non-college. Look, I think that one of the reasons that Joe Biden is losing, look, Joe Biden and Donald Trump is also old. Joe Biden is a very old guy. And there's no point in pretending otherwise. And young voters are kind of like, what are we doing here? And I think that he is not somebody where communication is his strong suit, where he's able to go out and sort of motivate people and get them excited. And he sort of ran on restoring things to normalcy. And I really agree with Simon on this chaos thing. Like, people are always like, well, won't it hurt the Republicans in the House? And I was like, if you're just a regular person, if you're just a regular voter, all you do is you see there's now 2 wars. Things seem crazy. They can't pass this stuff. And it just all looks chaotic and nuts. And I think that is hurting Biden in general, but also you got to understand how much young men, like, I think it is male minorities, but just young men in general, how attracted they are. There's like a new Barstool Sports phenomenon. I don't know if that means anything to anybody, but there's like a bro culture
Absolutely.
around Trump that is connected to MAGA.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that it's like a gender inequality, but I do think that Trump appeals to men in a very specific way that people have a tough time culturally getting their heads
That's
around.
Let me just
kind of
make
where I
two
was
quick-
going with my gender gap question is I like how you phrased it, the Barstool Sports. It is that kind of bro-y sort of culture. I have a 22-year-old son, so right there in the mix with you,
Yeah.
Simon. He was in law school right now, and he is very familiar, as I'm sure your kids are, Simon, as well, to seeing this happen. And it's fascinating to see the political dimensions of that. Simon?
Yeah, let me just make 2 points on this, and I call it the Joe Rogan, vote, right? I mean that, we have to actually start polling, I think, and as a question about whether you're a Joe Rogan follower to start identifying these voters you're talking about. And I do think that, yes, I think Trump was for young people who were coming of age, this kind of hyper masculinity and everything else was attractive to some people. And I think the abortion conversation may also be contributing to the sense that Democrats are more focused on things other than me, right? In that sense. But I don't want to leave without saying two things. The two largest polls done recently, large sample polls of Hispanics and young people, show Biden holding his 2020 numbers. The Univision poll that was done in the fall had Biden plus 27, which is about where he was in 2020. And the Harvard IOP poll that just came out, which is the gold standard 18 to 29-year-old poll, had Biden up 24 points with young people. That was his exact margin in 2022. So I don't know that we've had, the way I view this is that there is a portion of our coalition, 5-10% of the Biden coalition, that are wandering right now. We need to go get them back. I think we'll get a lot of them back, by March when it's Trump Biden, when, to Sarah's point, like, this is the choice, you got to make the choice. And then we're going to fight to make sure that they don't wander to third parties. I think very few of these people are going to wander to Trump, is my own view, or they don't vote. And so I think I'm more optimistic. I think some of the fraying of the Democratic coalition is a little bit exaggerated, and it's more of a weakness than a fraying, right? If I can say that. And that's why I think this is doable work for us in the next 11 months.
Paula asks, what do you think should be the Democrats' plan B if Biden is not able to continue all the way through?
I'm going to let Sarah answer that.
Get in a time machine, go back 10 months, have Joe Biden say, I'm not going to run again, and allow there to be an open field primary. Their plan B is Kamala Harris. There is no other thing. And I saw somebody when I was skimming the questions asking about, like, can Joe Biden switch Kamala Harris? And I have no reason to do other than to tell you guys the truth, because I play for no team other than democracy. But I got to tell you this, the political reality is, like, we're going to dance with the one who brought us here. Like, it is Biden Harris. He's not going to switch as vice president. He is not going to step down now. Either of these men, it is barring a health event that takes them out of this. They are doing this thing. There's no reason to play the sort of what ifs. Now, I mean, we're still.
Well, Paul is saying, what if there is an event that Joe Biden is not able to?
And I'm saying
get to the
it's
finish line?
Kamala Harris. There's a vice
Okay.
president, and that's it.
Yeah, Simon.
I agree.
So Gavin Newsom, no chance.
The reason there is a vice president, right, is to replace the president if anything happens. And I think that's the reality of where we are. I mean, and I think I will say, as somebody who's known the vice president for a long time, for 20 years, I think it's clear that she's assuming more and more responsibility every day. She's playing a much more higher profile role. She's doing more important international events. This is important because the whole reason the vice president's there is to be the understudy in case anything happens. And I think that the fact that she's taking on more and she's doing more and she's doing it well, I think that her body language and her demeanor and everything is so much, she seems happy, right? Like, she seems like she's enjoying herself. She's having a good time. And so I'm optimistic that, that whenever the vice president, it's always the case with the vice president, if anything were to happen to the president, that she's going to be ready. And I think that, so I feel like the additional responsibilities that she's taken on, both in terms of political and communications, have been very important. And I think she's a far more confident leader than she was 2 years ago. And you can just see it in the way that she's operating. So I think that's
you think
been
that she
beneficial.
you think she could beat a Republican candidate, Trump or anyone else?
I mean, I want to do what Sarah was a little bit more sort of forceful in her belief that she loses. I would come at this in another way, which is that we have no idea really what would happen. And I mean, it's such an unimaginable event that it would be hard for me under current polling, right? We know it would be unlikely, but I think we also have no way of knowing what happens. And I think we have to be a little bit open-minded in the terrible case that something were to happen, that, she would have the time and ability to go make her case. And that, all of you from California know she's a very capable politician and is, can connect with voters. And I think that, I think she got a little bit of a slow start in this administration. I think she's coming on strong now.
But I want to give each of you a chance to give a quick closing statement, just like minute tops, on what you think is the most interesting, most important aspect of these next several months before we get to the caucuses and primaries. Sarah, you want to go ahead and take that?
I actually think the most important thing, because I believe pretty firmly that Donald Trump's going to be the nominee, is that Joe Biden starts his campaign immediately. I have not quite understood why there hasn't been a greater sense of urgency about taking Trump on. I mean, one of the things that Joe Biden's really relying on is a contrast with Trump. That is it, right? He says, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. That is his campaign strategy. And so he needs to compare himself to that alternative as quickly as possible. I think one of the things that the media has been trying to grapple with is the fact that Trump, they're very sensitive to the idea that they amplified Trump and helped Trump in 2016 and maybe even 2020. And a weird counter thing is happening now where Trump is not getting a lot of attention. And as a result, people have sort of forgotten what they hate about Trump, and they're just very fixated on what they don't like about Biden. And that contrast can't happen sooner enough to shift the dynamic from where we are.
All right, Sarah, thank you so much. Simon, quick closing comment from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for Democrats, we have to just always be grounded in this basic reality that Joe Biden has been a good president. The country is better off. The Democratic Party is strong in winning elections all over the country, and they have Trump. And, as a strategist, I can see our victory, right? You can sell Biden, you can establish the contrast. I'm more skeptical that you can make Trump look like a serious presidential candidate again, particularly after the degradation that happens to his brand over all the court cases and everything else that's going to happen. I mean, even today, right? You saw, five Nevada Republicans were just indicted in the attempt to overthrow the election, including the state party chair. You had a suit that got settled in Wisconsin where now they're cooperating. These bubbling cases, again, as Sarah was mentioning, we lose a point here, a point there. Trump, the ability for Trump's brand to get further degraded over the next 11 months is very, very present, and it's a huge problem for him.
Simon, thank you very much. Sarah, thank you so much. Really outstanding analysis and conversation. It was great to talk with you both tonight. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful holiday season as well. Thank you. And thank you for joining us tonight for America at a Crossroads. Our next program is this coming Monday evening, Monday night of next week. That's December 11th, Israel in Crisis Briefing number 6. Aaron David Miller and Pat Morrison will examine the Biden administration's policy toward the Israel-Hamas war. So make sure you catch that. That's next Monday night for number 6 in the Israel in Crisis Briefing. I'm Larry Mantle. Thank you so much for being with us for these regular Wednesday night programs. Have a terrific rest of your evening.